Welcome to the Human Collab, a platform about people and their stories. For this podcast, we are in a conversation with Devika Manik. As an international para-athlete representing India, Devika's impressive tally includes 8 national and 3 international medals at the likes of the World Para-Athletics Grand Prix competition in the long jump and 100, 200 and 400 meter sprints. When she was barely a year old, Devika was diagnosed with hemiplegia, a condition that causes one side of the body to be paralyzed. But instead of letting this condition define her, she chose to redefine possibilities. And her achievements on the track were just the beginning. Beyond her athletic prowess, Devika is a passionate advocate for people with disabilities and diversity and inclusion champion. She co-founded the Wheeling Happiness Foundation, an organization dedicated to empowering people with disabilities. Her relentless dedication earned her the prestigious Queen's Young Leader Award in 2015. She has since addressed global platforms including the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, speaking in front of the British royal family and leaders from 53 Commonwealth countries. In this first part of a 2-part interview series with Devika, we get to know about her life beyond the medals. While we learn about her journey living with hemiplegia, we also learn about the unique experiences that led her to becoming a caregiver to her mum, who was also paralyzed below chest. We hear from her how these unique experiences and perspectives became the driving force behind Devika's passion for sports and her advocacy for diversity and inclusion. Just so you know, Devika's inspiration, her mum, Deepa Manik, is also an international para-athlete, a recipient of the Padma Shri and the Arjuna Award, and in fact, the first Indian woman to have won a medal at the Paralympic Games. And on that note, welcome to the Human Collab, Devika. Could you please share with us memories of your growing up years?
So I grew up basically in an army family. So I changed schools every 2 years. We were in a different city every 2 years. So for me as a kid, the way I recall it, it was fun because we got to have different experiences. We got to travel around the country, and because I used to mostly go to army schools, the uniform and the syllabus used to be pretty consistent, and it's not awkward when you join in the middle of a session. So in that sense, it was pretty nice. But because I had a disability pretty much since infancy, that was the challenging part, where every time I went to a new school, and also the nature of my disability is such that it's not an immediately visible disability, like I don't use a wheelchair or something like that. So it takes a few days of observation for people to understand that, I'm not just walking weirdly, or when I was younger, because the nature of my disability is such that I have a lot of movement coordination issues and muscle strength issues, and fine finger movements on the left side of my body are pretty limited, and even more so when I was a young child. So when I would go into a new school in first standard or in upper KG, that time even for the teachers to understand, it would take a while. Like initially they would assume that maybe I'm a intellectually slow child. So there have been a couple of instances, even with my clothes, initially the skirts would have hooks, or the shorts that we would wear as kids, they would be too complicated for me to navigate. Sometimes I would wet myself or something like that. So it took my parents also a few iterations to then understand that they had to modify the uniform to suit me. Then instead of hooks and buttons, everything had elastics. That's something that my mom had to do. And then even my school shoes, they had to buy 2 different pairs of sizes, because growing up in my left foot, it used to be one size smaller. So all of these things, and then, every 2 years or 1.5 years going into a new school and explaining to the teachers and the students from scratch, explaining the nature of my disability to them and what kind of accommodations I need. Specifically, I remember one time, this was the first or second day of a new school, and this was the first time that the teacher was writing on the blackboard. I think it was second standard, and we were expected to copy what the teacher was writing on the blackboard, and I was slow in doing that. So the teacher made a comment I have filled up the entire blackboard and you are still on the 3rd line, and so she was erasing it as she went along, and so she made fun of me for it. The kids laughed along, and then I kind of went home crying, and then my mother told me that every time we move to a new city, we can come and we can talk to your teachers, we can talk to your classmates, but how many times over would you want us to do that? You can stand up for yourself and you can explain it to them yourself. So then as a 6-7 year old, I started, going back to school and explaining to them that this is a condition that I have. Like, of course, to the best of my ability as a 6-year-old or 7-year-old that I could explain. Of course, in the background, my mother would have spoken to the teacher, but like she did that to give me that confidence that I can stand up for myself. So the teacher understood a little bit, and in the next exam, the teacher realized that, like, she gave me 10 minutes extra to write my paper, and then in that particular term, I topped the class, and like that gave me a feeling of confidence. So halfway through second standard is like the first time that I did really well in class, and throughout my school year, I always finished in the top 3, and I got like even by the end of second standard, like I got a special certificate which said that I had secured the highest marks in maths and science in my class. And then in 10th boards, for example, I secured 97% in Hindi, which was pretty unheard of at the time, like to get 97, 98 marks in a language paper, for which I got a special recognition from the CBSE board saying that you are in the top 0.1% of scorers in this subject. So, like, just that one boost of confidence from a teacher who, like, literally, and I don't blame her because she must have been a 24, 25-year-old girl herself. My fellow classmates would have been 6 or 7, and they didn't see that kind of diversity within their classroom, so they didn't know what to make of it. So, but for her to realize that, and for her to make amends and kind of try to understand what accommodations need to be made for me so that I can achieve my potential, that made all the difference. And then I was, from the time I topped my class in second standard, I just intrinsically became so passionate about my studies throughout school that, like, it was a personal goal to ensure that I never finished beyond like second position in class. This incident I still recall today because it was obviously very heartbreaking when it happened. But in hindsight, I do realize that, like, throughout school, my mom also made a lot of effort to ensure that I was not ashamed of my challenges or my disability, or I was not too introverted because of it, because that's how she had grown up. Like, her parents had always encouraged her to be very outgoing, and so she did the same with me. And so, of course, because of a lot of my coordination and balance issues, I still shied away from team sports because I had this feeling, like, that I would be the slowest one in my team, and my team would lose because of me. But I participated in a lot of debates and elocution competitions. I took part in plays and dramas throughout school. Like, that was an encouragement from my mom's end to ensure that I don't become very introverted and very shy. I don't feel ashamed of my disability. So that's how I was always very public facing, and like public speaking has been a part of my upbringing. In the long run, I think being able to have that sense of public speaking, of course, I took up sports later in life, but not having that stage fear, it has helped me even in my advocacy work. And when I talk about disability awareness, whether it is at the United Nations or the Commonwealth, in order to be able to carry that message, of course, you need to know how to put it across, and you need to not have that like fear of public speaking. And that is something that I got from my school years because it was heavily encouraged by my mother.
What is the term hemiplegia? And if you could give us a background into, what was the age and, when you all got aware that this is what you went through?
So hemiplegia basically means that it's like paralysis, but laterally on one side of your body. Instead of both lower limbs, it's one upper limb and one lower limb, and usually on the same side. Like, for example, in my case, it's the left side of my body. So it's a combination of factors. First, initially, when I was born very, very premature, like almost six and a half months when I was born instead of a full term. And then immediately when I was born, I had a shortage of oxygen. I had neonatal jaundice. Then I was in an incubator for about 2 months. So that had an impact. And then in addition to that, when I was about 1.5 years old, I had a road accident, which basically led to an injury on the right side of my brain. because of which the left side of my body is impacted. The ventricles on the right side of my brain are dilated essentially. So that pressure which it puts on the brain, because of that, the left side of my body is impacted. So everything from, like, initially, of course, when I was a toddler, everything had to be relearned. Like, whatever developmental progress I had made, everything had to be started over, and then with a lot of physiotherapy, with a lot of occupational therapy, and also till about 5 years of age, they would do my MRIs every year, because they also needed to figure out if the brain injury has had any impact on my IQ levels and general intelligence. But yeah, essentially that's what hemiplegia is. It impacts like one side of your body, and to varying degrees. And also it's a version of a larger umbrella called cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy shows up in varying degrees of severity. Like, there are people with cerebral palsy who are wheelchair users. There are people with cerebral palsy who cannot even speak, so they are non-verbal. This is within the umbrella of cerebral palsy.
Thank you for sharing that, Devika. You've already mentioned that, growing up years were different. But you also mentioned certain very beautiful aspects where, your mom was very inspirational throughout. And the way she brought you up to face these situations were a motivating factor for you. Anything from that portion you wish to highlight? Because you were only 6 years old. What would the conversation be with you, and how would she kind of, nudge you in that direction of helping you understand and accept your situation, and then taking it forward from there for a 6-year-old to in whatever strength she can explain it to people that, look, this is how I am, and you need to work around me.
So I was never, like, in my household or by my parents, like, it was never communicated to me in a way that something is wrong with me. It was just a part of my daily routine. Like, my mom sometimes I used to find it very annoying as well. Like, things like, because of course initially she would take me for occupational therapy or physiotherapy with the therapist, but then they learned what needed to be done, and we could do it at home as well. So what she would do is, sometimes she would take like a jar of pulses and she would just empty it on the table, and then for my fine finger movement, I had to use my left hand to pick up like one piece at a time and put it back in the jar. Or like, the length of my left arm is different than the length of my right arm. So growing up years, when your bones are still malleable, some doctors had advised to tie my hands, like these contraptions which have rods in them. If you tie it for a few hours every day, the bone will stretch and extend, and the length will become better. So that used to be very painful. I had to do all of those things, and like, in addition to everything else that my friends were doing or going out to play in the evening, even like cycling, for example, I think it is a very big achievement that my parents could teach me to cycle, because with all the coordination issues that I had, objectively speaking, it must not have been easy for them to teach me to cycle, but like something that comes so naturally to most children. For me, like, I'm sure that took an additional amount of time to teach me that as well. But these, occupational therapies or exercises that I had to do, I was just told that it is a part of my routine. I was never told, they never told it to me in a way that, like, something is wrong with you, that is why you have to do it. It is just like something we have to do. And of course, as I got older, I would find ways to get around it and not do it. But still, I'm very glad that until I was 12, 13 years old, my mother could consistently make me do all these occupational therapies and physiotherapies, though of course it might have been irritating as a child. But whatever progress I have made in terms of my well-being, and spite of the nature of my injury and the nature of my disability, the extent of mobility that I do have, that is because in those formative years, they worked at it and they ensured that I got my exercise.
You also mentioned the fact that, every 2 years you all were expected to change schools, while family was a constant source of, support. But when you moved around in your surroundings, for the lack of better knowledge, there is a difference in the way people looked at you or way you were assimilating with, everybody around you, making friends, etc.?
Now when I look back, I do have some of my oldest friends from like the time when I was maybe in 8th grade, and I'm still in touch with those people. So I think friends are the one constant you have, of course, in addition to family, who are non-judgmental in that sense. But of course, initially, like I said, like as you get older, obviously everybody's parents teaches them to be courteous and not say the wrong thing or whatever it is. It's more in the formative years when, kids are just being kids and they don't know any better. So they just like, call it as they see it. And so they might be saying something that is hurtful without recognizing it. And that is the time when, my mother's, in fact, both my parents' support kind of helped me to deal with that. And like I said, like I learned very early on that if you are, laughing with people rather than allowing them the opportunity to laugh at you, just becomes easier. Like it appears like a novel and different thing to them for 3-4 days, but then they also get used to seeing you around. And then the initial remarks which are made, if you don't react very adversely to it, so that is one way I learned to cope, like, just to like, laugh along with the joke and then point it out to them. So then in turn, they only feel embarrassed that, oh, like, we made fun of something medical without realizing it. And this I can even carry into my college years. Like, for example, this is another instance that I often talk about. Like the first day of my graduation, I did my graduation at Ferguson College in Pune. So the first day when I went to college and people were just interacting and getting to know each other, one boy just pointed out that like, oh, you walk like a duck, so I'm going to call you Daffy. So I was like, yeah, sure. Like, we all laughed about it. I was like, yeah, you can call me Daffy. But when they were done having a round of laugh and chatter about it, then I was like, but this is what is the issue. And that is why I walk with a limp. So then he was severely embarrassed and like, severely apologetic. Oh, like I thought that's just how you walk. I didn't know it's because you have a problem. I'm so sorry. But then because I took it in my stride, that group of people kind of, ended up becoming my closest group of friends throughout college, and I'm still in touch with them today. And they still call me Daffy. But like, instead of becoming a term which, instead of being offensive, it became a term of endearment. So because of how I reacted to it, I took away the negative connotation and the negative power of the word, and instead it became a term of endearment. That is like basically my takeaway from the whole thing, because it's not always that people want to be insensitive or that like, people are mean. A lot of times it's because we don't know what diversity looks like. Many schools even today which will not give admission to kids on wheelchairs because they say like, who will assist them around, who will always be chaperoning them. If something happens, we will not take responsibility. So if kids are not seeing that diversity around them, because kids will only respond to like whatever is in their natural environment, or if somebody has a disabled brother or sister at home. So since we are exposing our children to very limited diversity by design or just by nature, that is the reason when they see something different, it stands out to them. So throughout my life, like as soon as I learned that I can use it as a teachable moment, like you just asked me, like, what is hemiplegia? So if somebody reads this, it can be a teachable moment for them. They will learn about one more kind of way that a person can exist. So yeah, I just like learned to take it in my stride and make the best of it.
You've come a long way, Devika, from the time that, you were detected as a child with hemiplegia to today where, you have an added sense of self-worth, the way you carry yourself, the way you ensure that people are aware of these areas. How has your ability of self-worth evolved over all these years? Today, when you look at yourself, how's the journey of evolution been for you, or how do you continue that journey further?
So I feel that my disability is a very integral part of my identity and who I am as a person. Like, of course, when we even teach people how to interact with people with disabilities or how to integrate and assimilate people with disabilities, we always say that look at the person first, and that is reflected in the language as well, because we are saying people with disabilities, so it's the people first and then the disability. So when we use this person first language, what we are doing is that we are focusing on the individual and their abilities first, and then corollary to that is the fact that okay, this person lives with the disability, and that might come with certain extra adjustments or accessibility needs. But irrespective of that, I do feel that the fact that I have this disability, and also the fact that my mother has a disability and I'm one of her caregivers, that is an integral part of my identity, because that has shaped my worldview and that has shaped essentially what I do for a living. Because for the last decade or so, I have been running my organization as well, and similarly since 2006 I have been watching my mother compete in disability sport. Since 2010, off and on, I have been competing in disability sport. So it has, everything that happens to us shapes our personality and our identity. And in a lot of ways, even my mother says that, the fact that both of us in the same family have, of course, the nature of our disabilities is different, but the fact that we both live with disabilities and we both know how to deal with it, we can impart this knowledge to other people, and we can, use our lived experience to sensitize people about disabilities, because it's not a small number of people. It's 15% of the entire world's population that lives with a disability. And disability itself is such a dynamic lived experience, because it is the only, I would say, it's the only minority population in the world that you are not part of by nature. Like, you're not part of a minority by caste, you're not part of a minority by gender, because those are static things. But disability is a dynamic minority in the sense that it can happen to anyone at any point in time in their lives. It only takes a few seconds. A road accident, it only takes a few seconds. An adventure sport accident, it only takes a few seconds. So yeah, disability is a reality of everyone's life, because at some point in your life, whether it's a fracture for 3 months or whether it's something more permanent, something or the other is going to happen to you or to someone in your close circle. And the more you deal, the more you are a person who looks at, disability as diversity, or you are equipped to deal with accepting diversity around you in whatever form it may come, the better it is for everyone. So if by design, my being disabled, I'm being able to, contribute to that conversation, and I'm being able to contribute to making the world a little bit more accessible, then I think it's like a superpower almost.
In fact, you brought something out which, stuck to me, and let me ask you about this. You mentioned about, being a person with disability and being a caretaker to your mom.
So my mother has paralysis below her chest, and she basically she had an infection in her spinal cord, which led to a tumor which had to be extracted. And a similar thing happened to her when she was 5 years old. But back then, when they operated and got rid of it, it was about a 3-year stint that she had in the hospital, and then eventually she could get back to walking, and she was fine. But then in 1999, it happened again, and by then I was 8 years old and my younger sister was 3 years old. And in 99, when this happened to her, that time, even before the surgery, the doctors had pretty much advised that because of the location of the tumor is such that it would not, your spinal cord basically connects to different, it connects your brain to different parts of your body. So the junction where the tumor was is basically connected to everything below her chest, including your internal organs. So the doctors had pretty much mentioned that you would most likely not be able to walk again after this surgery, but the other alternative is death. So since I was 8.5 years old, and my mother was already working with me for my occupational therapy, since then it's been a symbiotic relationship where, like, when she came back from the hospital after her surgery and everything, there were a lot of tasks that I could perform. Like, back then, mobile phones were a very new thing, and even microwave ovens were a very new concept for middle class families. But my mom got a microwave oven installed, so that, like, as kids, we did not have to use fire to reheat stuff. But she would, like, tell us what to do. Like, basically, it would be like her brain and my body, because she could tell me what to do and I could carry out those tasks, like especially initial 2-3 years when she was completely bedridden and still recovering from surgery. So it has been like a great symbiotic relationship between me and my mom, where we've found this beat of working together since the time when I was 8 and she was first operated on. And then eventually, of course, she got more independent on the wheelchair, and initially she started a restaurant of her own, because she's always been very entrepreneurial and very outgoing, and she's a go-getter. So, like, if you are a wheelchair user, basically, if you can't walk, it can be very limiting if you don't have anything to do. Like, for example, she created, like, work for herself by turning into an entrepreneur and running this restaurant. She had somewhere to go every day. Like, she had to go and purchase raw materials. Then she had to, like, run the whole place, because sitting on a wheelchair, administration you can still do, right? Like, basically, you can do administrative tasks. You can work on a laptop. The only thing you can't do is literally walk. So manual labor maybe you can't do, but anything that is related to administration, that can be done. So she started her restaurant, and then in 2006 she discovered sports, so she started going for sports. And then of course she needs assistance with tasks, like if she has to change her clothes or other intimate hygiene stuff, she needs help with that. So one or the other family member is always with her. Now she has trained staff, but so, like, it's either the trained staff member or myself or my sister, someone or the other is always there. So because I was always around her, and I was always observing how she is going about things, that has been a salient inspiration to me, like, throughout my life. And when she started competing in disability sport, in para sport, that's when we started going to the, state level championships or national championships. And that's where I observed that this is actually a whole other world of sports, where people like me also compete internationally. And, like, this is a legitimate, professional, very high level competition. And for the first time, I remember in 2010, I told my mom, like, in this way, even I can do sports. So then I started competing in short distance, like 100 and 200 meters. And none of that would have happened, like, if my mom had not taken that initiative. So that's why, like, of course, that's the combination of course, being a caregiver to her, but then also, like, because of the things that I have been exposed to, because of her lived experience and her initiative taking, it has opened so many doors for me. So I always think of it as a very symbiotic relationship between the two of us.
So inspiring what you just said, because of times there is a misconception that when people are at a particular level or successful, it's because they have resources and at their disposal, and that's how they can get there. But you were barely a kid when your mom went through her condition, and it was purely a family effort that you all put in together. So like you said, her brain, your body, and it was coordinated in a particular manner. And the way, you create your path at times, these words are purely inspirational.
Now through the foundation, when we conduct disability awareness workshop, we often speak to the caregivers, and this is what the knowledge that we try to impart is that as a caregiver, it's not your job to dictate to the person with disability what they should and shouldn't do with their life. As a caregiver, it is our job to basically, find out what the person wants to do, where their interests lie, and facilitate that to the best of our capacity. Like, just because somebody is depending on us for their mobility doesn't mean that we get to dictate how they live their life. And of course, we also recognize that there is a certain amount of mental strength that is required. There's a certain amount of time that you have to dedicate as a caregiver, time, resources, and it can get a little bit sometimes it can get overwhelming. So I studied psychology eventually, and that is one of the things I do as well. Like, we counsel caregivers as well, because it is, of course, if somebody meets with an accident and acquires a disability later in life, it is an adjustment for them, but it is equally an adjustment for their near and dear ones who will now be caregivers. So they have to educate themselves about the changes. They have to educate themselves. They have to learn how to be the best possible caregiver, because sometimes we get these kind of things from parents. Example, a girl child who has acquired a disability, the parents get very fearful and they tell the girl, don't go anywhere, don't do anything, don't step outside the house. It is coming from a place of concern because they are scared that now this child is disabled, so what if we let her go and do sports or something and she further gets injured. But then we counsel them that we understand that you're trying to shelter and protect the child, but is this the best, most holistic way for them to live? So you have to also, as caregivers, understand that the mental well-being of the person under your care is equally important, and what keeps them in the best spirit, what makes them happy, what makes them feel like they are actually independent human beings and they don't feel like a burden on you. So it's both ways. Of course, the person with disability has to be sensitized, but equally the people who are serving as caregivers to those people have to be sensitized.
This wraps up the first part of the two-part interview series with Devika. We heard about her early experience dealing with insensitive comments, including being ignorantly nicknamed tacky in college, and how she chose to face these situations with humor and grace. Ultimately, she created supporters out of those ignorant to her condition. As she grew, her understanding evolved, realizing that people are often insensitive due to lack of awareness. In the second part, we continue our conversation with Devika to understand her perspective on how disability influences relationships. Learn more about the Wheeling Happiness Foundation and bust some of the common myths about disabilities. If you enjoyed this podcast so far, do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the Human Collapse YouTube channel and the various other social media platforms mentioned in the description below. By sharing this episode with your friends and family, you will help to foster a community where strength and compassion thrive.